The wind in Canyon del Fierro did not just blow, it scoured. It was a high, thin sound, a razor drawn across the sandstone battlements that clawed at the Arizona sky. This was 1876, or perhaps 1877. Time in the territory had a way of smearing together, measured less by calendars than by the grit in a man's teeth. Here, the world was vertical. Red rock walls dropped 1,000 feet, and the plateaus were tables swept clean by that constant, cutting wind. It left nothing soft. Nights were a brittle cold that cracked the skin, and days were a dry, baking heat that seemed to draw the moisture from a body's very bones. Far off, beyond the last juniper scrub, a wolf might cry, but it was a lonely sound, swallowed by the sheer emptiness. The trails, such as they were little more than veins of red dust. Canyon del Fierro was sacred. It was the heart of the land for the small, free band of Apache who still refused the reservations. Their leader was a man named Nietzsche. He was young for a chief, his face kept quiet and unreadable, marked already by the scars of skirmishes the settlements never heard about. His people moved with the seasons and the wind, and this canyon was their sanctuary. The gateway to this land, the last infected blister of civilization before the true wilderness, was the Dead Mule Trading Post. It was a name born of hard truth. The post was a squat, ugly collection of adobe and raw lumber, hunkered against a bluff as if seeking protection from the very land it exploited. It was a place of ends, the end of the trail for hopeful miners, the end of dreams for families who arrived with wagons and found only dust, and the end of freedom for those who walked inside. The Dead Mule was where hope was traded for salt, flour, and debt. Barnaby Slate ran the post, and he ran it not with a gun, though he wore one, but with a thick, leather-bound ledger. Slate was a pale man in a sun-scorched land, his eyes the color of muddy water. He managed the flow of rumor as expertly as he managed his inventory. He knew who was desperate. His establishment offered bride contracts for women who had survived the journey west only to find themselves widowed or abandoned, binding them into service or marriage for the price of their passage. He held the food, and thus he held the people. The air in the post was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, greasy wool blankets, and the sharp, acidic tang of Barnaby Slate's cheap cigars. Claire O'Rourke was breathing that air now, and she hated it. She stood near the back, by a barrel of dusty beans, pretending to examine a bolt of calico she had no intention of buying. She was 24 years old, though the dust and the sun had tried to age her faster. She was Irish, with the kind of dark, heavy hair that refused to stay pinned and eyes the color of a northern sea. Her hands, resting on the rough fabric, were steady and capable, the nails short, the knuckles smudged with graphite. Ostensibly, Claire was an ethnographer. She carried letters of introduction from a respectable geographical society back east. Her commission was to sketch the flora, fauna, and native inhabitants of the Arizona territory. She was, on paper, a woman of science and art, recording a disappearing world. Her heavy leather satchel, which she never let out of her sight, contained pristine sketching pads, watercolors, and measuring tools. This was the truth, but it was not the whole truth. Tucked beneath the scholarly papers, wrapped in oilcloth, was another set of maps. These were not for the society. These were for Colonel Beauregard Pike, the head of security for the railroad. Pike was a man who saw the West not as a place to be understood, but as a thing to be broken, measured, and crossed with iron. His payments were regular, delivered in heavy envelopes by couriers who did not give their names. Claire O'Rourke was a surveyor. She was a damn good one. She could read the land, understand its contours, and see the invisible lines of grade and elevation. And Pike's commission was precise. He did not care about the Apache. He cared about water. He cared about the easiest path for his tracks. He cared, most of all, about a rumored project, a dam that would turn a series of canyons into a massive reservoir. providing power and water for the towns that would follow the railroad. This was the gray, sickening weight in her stomach. She told herself the work was neutral. She was just recording what was there. Geography, science. But the envelopes from Pike felt heavy with more than just coin. He had directed her interest toward this specific region. He wanted the passes, the water levels, the choke points. He wanted the entrance to the sacred valley, the one the Apache called Cañón del Fierro. And Claire, with her precise instruments and her steady hand, was mapping it for him. She was marking the very place he intended to drown. The tension in the territory was a palpable thing, thick as the dust. There were new orders from Tucson, demanding all Apache report to the San Carlos Reservation, a patch of land so barren it was called Hell's 40 Acres by the soldiers who guarded it. Bounties were offered for scalps, a fact that blurred the line between law and butchery. The railroad was pushing west, a relentless iron snake, and it demanded the land be cleared. The dam was the final solution, a way to erase the Apache's past by flooding their ancestral burial grounds. Claire knew this. She knew it not as a rumor, but as a set of coordinates on a map she herself was drawing. She believed, or tried to believe, that recording a people was a way of honoring them. But the money in her saddlebag, the money that bought her supplies and her solitude, was the same money funding the destruction of the very things she recorded. The low murmur of the trading post men haggling over ammunition, the clink of glasses. Slate's oily voice stopped. It did not stop suddenly. It tapered off, like water draining from a tub, until the only sound was the high, thin scream of the wind outside the poorly fitted door. Claire turned her head slowly. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, but it was his stillness that held the room. He was not a white man. He was Apache. He wore hide leggings and a simple tunic, the kind Claire had only seen in blurred photographs. His black hair was held back by a simple cloth band. He was wrapped in a dust scarf that covered the lower half of his face, but it did nothing to hide the intensity of his presence. A long scar, old and white, ran from his left temple down to his jawline. His eyes, fixed on nothing in the room, were black, flat, and still. They were like obsidian, reflecting everything and revealing nothing. He moved from the doorway, a single, fluid motion. The men miners, freighters, a pair of soldiers on leave shifted. They did not reach for their guns. Not yet. His stillness was a challenge, but it was not a direct threat. He carried a knife on his belt and a quiver on his back, but his hands were empty. He walked to the counter where Barnaby Slate stood, his own hand resting just below the countertop, near his ledger and his pistol. The Apache unwrapped a bundle from his shoulder. He laid 3 perfect silver fox pelts on the rough wood. He did not speak. He simply pushed them forward with 2 fingers, then tapped a squat canvas sack of salt. Slate's muddy eyes flickered over the man, then to the pelts. He wanted to refuse. Claire could see the desire in the tightening of his mouth. But the pelts were thick, prime winter skins. They were worth a dozen sacks of salt. "That'll get you 1 bag," Slate said, his voice greasy. The Apache did not look at him. He simply waited. The silence in the room stretched. It became heavier than the roof beams. Slate's face flushed. He looked around, seeking support from the silent onlookers. He found none. He found only fear and a grudging respect for the man who had walked in alone. With a grunt, Slate shoved a bag of salt across the counter. The Apache did not take it. He pointed, once, at a second bag. "Now you listen here," Slate began. The Apache chief raised his head. He looked at Barnaby Slate. He did not move. He did not threaten. He just looked. His eyes were stones. They were the mountains. They were the cold, empty distance of the high desert. They promised nothing but what was. Slate's words died in his throat. With a muttered curse, he shoved the second bag of salt forward. The Apache chief, Naichi, gathered the 2 bags in one hand, slung them over his shoulder, and turned. He did not hurry. He walked back toward the door. As he passed Claire, his head turned. Their eyes met for perhaps a second. She saw no recognition, no curiosity. She saw only an assessment, as cold and precise as her own measurements of the land. He looked at her, and in that moment, she felt completely and utterly seen, not as a woman or a scientist, but as one more strange, pale, and temporary object in his world. Then he was gone, stepping from the stuffy, dark post back into the searing wind, which immediately whipped the dust around him, as if claiming him back. The room exhaled. The murmuring began again. But it was different. That was him. That was Naichi. What's he doing this close to the post damn nerve? Walking in like he owns it? He does own it, a quiet voice said from the corner, but no one answered. Claire O'Rourke turned back to the calico, but her hands were shaking. The graphite felt slick in her fingers. She thought of her maps, the clean lines, the precise numbers, the neat labels, and she thought of the man's eyes. She was marking a path to his home. She was a tool for the men who wanted to chase him, cage him, or kill him. The society letters in her bag felt like a lie. The money from Pike felt like blood. She bought nothing. She picked up her satchel, holding it tight to her side, and walked out of the dead mule trading post. The wind hit her like a slap, stinging her eyes with the red dust. It tasted of grit and juniper and an emptiness so vast it felt like the end of the world. And somewhere in that wind, Naichi was moving, a silent shadow on a land he knew, a land she was helping to steal. The heat of the day did not linger. When the sun dropped behind the canyon walls, the cold fell like an axe. It was a few hours past dusk, and the dead mule trading post was now a box of foul, smoky light in the vast, freezing dark. This was the night. Barnaby Slate called it a labor auction, a term he found civilized. The men in the post just called it Slate's cattle market. Claire O'Rourke stood in the shadows of the livery stable across the square, her coat pulled tight, her breath plumed white. She was here for one person, Lola Esquivel. Lola was a widow from Sonora, a woman Claire had traveled with for 100 miles on the trail, sharing water and mending a broken wagon wheel together. Lola's husband had died of cholera 2 weeks shy of the trading post, leaving her with 2 children and his crushing debt to Slate. Slate had seized her wagon, her mules, and had added her contract to the night's ledger. Claire had the money. It was Pike's money, dirty and heavy in her purse. She was going to use it to buy Lola's freedom. It felt like a small, desperate act of balancing her own corrupted ledger. The stable smelled of manure and old straw. She watched as Slate nailed a fresh torch to the post by his main door, illuminating the crude platform. Men drifted from the saloon, tin cups in hand. They were miners, a few teamsters, and the usual lost souls of the post. All right, gentlemen. Slate's voice was a wet rasp, oiled with false cheer. A few items of quality for your consideration tonight. We are, as always, here to build a community. He brought out a woman Claire did not know, a pale blonde with eyes so empty they looked punched from her face. Her contract was sold for $40 in supplies and a line of credit. Then came Lola. Lola Esquivel walked onto the platform, her back straight. She did not look at the crowd. She held her head high, a silent, defiant statue. Next, we have Lola Esquivel, Slate announced, a good worker, proven hardy, strong back. Her debt stands at $112. Claire's stomach twisted. She stepped from the shadows, her satchel clutched in one hand, her purse in the other. The men turned, surprised to see her. She was the quiet map lady. She did not belong in this part of the post's life. Mr. Slate, she said, her voice clear and cold, louder than she intended. I will pay her debt. A silence fell, different from the one Naichi had commanded. This was the silence of confusion. Slate's muddy eyes fixed on her. He smiled, a slow unfolding of rotten teeth. Well, Miss O'Rourke, a charitable act. We do not often see that, $112. You said—" "I did," Claire said, walking forward. She opened her purse. The men parted for her. She could feel their eyes, curious and hungry. She reached the platform, standing below Slate. Lola's gaze met hers, sharp with disbelief and a sudden, terrible hope. "The money," Claire said, holding up the leather purse. Of course," Slate said, leaning down. His hand was quick. He reached for the purse, his other hand fumbling with his ledger. In the tangle of the exchange, his sleeve caught. He jostled her hand, and her purse was gone, replaced by a much lighter, smaller coin bag from his own belt. It was the kind of swap a magician does, or a pickpocket. "My apologies, miss," he said, tucking her heavy purse into his own coat. "Sloppy of me. That is not—" Claire began, feeling the lighter bag in her hand. "You took my—" And then the world exploded. A high, ululating shriek cut the night. It was a sound from a nightmare. A volley of gunfire erupted, not aimed at the post, but over it. Bullets screamed into the sky. From the darkness at both ends of the street, horsemen charged. They wore feathers in their hair and had streaks of paint on their faces. They whooped and hollered, firing their rifles in the air. Apache, a man, screamed, and the square dissolved into chaos. Men dove for cover. Glasses smashed. The pale woman who had been sold was knocked to the ground. Slate, his face white with a terror that looked almost genuine, scrambled back into his store. But something was wrong. Claire, frozen for a second, saw it. The riders were clumsy. They sat their horses like sacks of flour, not like the fluid. Perfect riders she had been told the Apache were. They were white men, under the paint. She saw pale skin. Their whoops were practiced, hollow. This was a play. This was a performance. Then the fire started. One of the riders tossed a torch onto the roof of the livery stable. The dry straw inside would catch in minutes. The fake Apache were not killing. They were hurting. They were creating panic, shouting, and breaking things. One of them, a big man on a bay horse, rode straight for the platform. He leaned down and grabbed Lola, pulling her up by the arm. Another man grabbed Claire. "Got this one," he shouted, his voice thick, not with an Apache accent, but with one from somewhere back east. He seized her arm and her satchel. The leather strap of her satchel dug into her shoulder as he hauled her, pulling her off her feet. Then a new sound, a single rifle shot, flat and sharp, from above. The main torch that Slate had lit, the one illuminating the whole square, exploded in a spray of sparks and burning oil. The square was plunged into near total darkness, the only light coming from the new, growing fire at the livery. A voice cut through the chaos, low and calm. "The alley! Go! Now!" It came from the roof of the trading post. Naichi. He had not left. He had been watching. The terrified townsfolk, the real ones, scrambled toward the alley between the post and the smithy. Naichi had given them an escape. The man holding Claire cursed in the dark. He still had her satchel. Where did he go? Naichi was no longer on the roof. He was on the ground. A shadow moving within shadows. He was not fast. He was just there. Claire saw the glint of the fire on a rifle barrel. The man holding her raised his own pistol, turning toward the movement. Naichi was on him. He did not use his rifle. He moved under the man's arm and struck him once in the throat. It was a silent, economical movement. The man made a wet, choking sound and fell from his horse. In the confusion, the satchel was ripped from her shoulder. The strap snapped. Her sketches, her tools, her watercolors, and Pike's maps scattered into the dust and the chaos. Naichi saw them, even in the smoke. He saw a sheet of paper land near his feet. He saw the sharp, clean lines. He saw the symbol for a rail line, the markers for elevation. Another rider, the one who had grabbed Lola, saw his partner fall. He raised his rifle, aiming at the center of the shadow that was Naichi. Naichi did not look at him. He looked at Claire. He lunged, grabbing the front of her coat and her arm, and pulled. He pulled her with a force that stole her breath, yanking her clear of the space where she'd been standing, a space that was instantly filled by the sound of a gunshot. The bullet tore through the air where her chest had been. Claire cried out, a thin moan of pain. It was not the bullet. It was his hand. He had grabbed her by the shoulder, the same one the fake raider had wrenched, and the pain was a white-hot spike. He shoved her behind a wooden water trough, pushing her down into the mud and filth. His hand was still on her, one hand on her shoulder, the other pressing her head down. He was using her as a shield, or protecting her. She could not tell. He was looking at her, his eyes black in the firelight. The suspicion was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He had seen the map. He knew what she was. A horse screamed. One of the fallen attackers, the one Naichi had hit, was trying to crawl away. His saddle was stark in the light of the burning stable. On the leather flap, clear as day, was a brand, a circle with the letter P inside it. Pike's Security Company. Naichi saw it, too. His eyes tracked from the brand to the spent cartridges glinting in the dirt. He knew the casings. .4440, the kind the soldiers used at the forts. They were not Apache arrows. The raid, the entire performance, was over. The remaining riders, dragging their fallen, were galloping out of town, shouting their fake war cries. The townsfolk were already emerging, their terror turning to rage. Apache. It was an Apache raid. They set fire to the livery. They took Lola. A woman cried. Naichi knew what was happening. This was the excuse. This was the event Pike needed. The stolen woman. The burned building. This was the prelude to a war that would be blamed on his people. He stood, pulling Claire up with him. His grip was iron. "You come," he said. She stumbled, shaking, her shoulder on fire. "What?" "No, they have Lola. Lola is gone," he said, his voice flat. "They will say I did this. They will say I took the white woman." He looked at her, and his eyes were ice. "And I will." Before she could understand, he looped his arm around her waist, pulling her tight against him. He was not gentle. It was not a rescue. It was an abduction, but a different kind. "They need a reason to hunt," he whispered, his voice so low it was barely a sound under the shouting. "I will give them one, but it will be on my terms." He began to run, dragging her with him, away from the burning light of the post, away from the gathering posse and into the deep, cold darkness of the canyons. Behind them, she heard Barnaby Slate's voice, already ringing with righteous indignation, the lie already spreading like the fire. "They've taken her, the Apache chief. He took Miss O'Rourke. Get your rifles. Boys, we got us a kidnapping." He did not run toward the mountains. He ran toward the water, pulling her with him. His grip on her arm was a manacle of hard flesh and bone. She stumbled, her feet catching on rocks and scrub, her shoulder a scream of pure agony. He did not slow. They were running in the deep, moonless dark, but he moved as if it were daylight. He knew every stone, every dry wash, the shouts from the trading post, the disorganized rage of the gathering posse grew fainter, swallowed by the wind and the sheer, uncaring emptiness of the high desert. He ran her until her lungs were fire and her legs were water. Finally, he pulled her into a gash in the earth, a deep arroyo that stank of alkali and dry roots. He let go of her arm. She collapsed against the dirt wall, gasping, her body shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He stood a few feet away, a shadow against the slightly less black wall of the canyon, listening. He was not breathing hard. "They will follow," she choked out, her throat raw. "They have horses." "They will follow the fire," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They will be drunk. They will be slow. They will be looking for Apache. Not for me." He seemed to be waiting. The silence stretched, filled only by her ragged breathing and the high, thin cry of the wind far above them. He moved suddenly, grabbing her arm again. "We go." They climbed. They did not follow a trail. They followed a path of impossible, vertical logic. He moved like a creature of the rock, his feet and hands finding holds she could not see. He forced her up, pushing her from behind, pulling her from above. The cold was seeping into her, a deep, paralyzing force. Her soaked skirts, legacy of the water trough, were beginning to freeze stiff. After what felt like an hour, they reached a wider expanse of flat rock and a new sound, a rushing, angry roar. The Rio Seco. In the faint starlight, she could see it. It was not a dry river now. It was a churning white froth sluice of snowmelt from the high peaks, a dozen yards across and running with the force of a locomotive. It was death. "We cannot," she said, pulling back, her voice shaking. "It is impossible. It is necessary," he said. He did not ask for her hand. He grabbed her waist, his arm a band of iron, and plunged into the water. The shock of the cold was so total, so absolute. It blasted the air from her lungs. She could not scream. She could not breathe. The current seized them immediately. The bottom was not sand. It was a bed of moving, slick boulders. She lost her footing. Her feet swept away, and she felt the terrible sucking power of the river pulling her down. She went under. The water was a roaring, black, freezing hell. A hand grabbed a fistful of her hair. It was not gentle. It was brutal, and it saved her life. He hauled her head above the surface. She sputtered, choking, tasting the grit. He did not stop moving. He was braced against the current, his legs planted, dragging her through the torrent. She felt a boulder slam into her thigh, a dull, sickening impact. But he did not let her go. He half dragged, half threw her onto the opposite bank. She landed on a bed of mud and sharp reeds, coughing up icy water, her body shaking in a violent, uncontrollable spasm. She was too cold to even feel the pain. He stood over her, a dark shape, water pouring from his leggings. He was breathing hard now, the first sign of exertion she had seen from him. He had saved her, after abducting her, after she had helped to doom his people. The contradictions were too much. She lay in the mud and felt a wild, inappropriate urge to laugh, or perhaps to die. He nudged her with his foot. "Get up, we freeze here." He was right. The wind on her wet clothes was 1,000 tiny knives. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. She was spent, with a sound of profound impatience. He bent down. He did not offer a hand. He hauled her to her feet, slung her over his shoulder as if she were a sack of grain, and began to climb the far bank. He carried her for perhaps a mile, moving up a steep goat path, until he found a shallow cave, a hollow in the rock shielded from the wind. He dumped her unceremoniously on the dry, dusty floor. He built no fire. He simply sat, his back to the cave entrance, watching the darkness. "You," she said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "You saw the map, you know." He did not turn. "I know." "It was a job," she whispered, the excuse tasting like ash in her mouth. "I am an ethnographer, a surveyor. I was paid to draw the land." He turned his head. Even in the blackness of the cave, she could feel the weight of his stare. "You were paid to draw a grave. For my people, for the spirits of my grandfather." The truth came out of her, a broken, shameful torrent. "Yes, I was a man named Pike, Colonel Beauregard Pike. He paid me. He said it was for the railroad, for a water route." "A dam," Nietzsche said. It was not a question. "I did not know," she cried, the lie desperate. "I did not know it was sacred. I did not know it was a burial ground. I thought it was just an empty canyon. I swear it." She expected him to shout, to call her a liar. She had seen the rage in white men, the hot, explosive kind. She expected him to hit her. She would have almost understood it. Instead, he went utterly, terribly quiet. He stood up, a slow unfolding of coiled power. He walked to her, and she pressed herself back against the cold stone, a small, involuntary whimper escaping her. He stood directly over her. She could feel the radiating heat of his silent fury. He raised his hand. Claire flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, turning her face to the rock. The blow never came. She opened her eyes. He was standing there, his hand still in the air, but his fist was clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was shaking, not with cold, but with a contained violence that terrified her more than any blow. He looked at his own hand, and then at her. He spat a single sharp word in his own language, a word of profound self-disgust. He lowered his arm. He turned his back to her. "You," he said, his voice a rasp. "You will not go back. You will not draw for him again." "They will find me," she whispered, the terror still making her shake. "They think you kidnapped me. They will hunt you. They will hang you." "Let them hunt," he said. He reached down to her belt, where she kept her tools. His touch was rough, impersonal. He unhooked her good brass compass. He took the small, oilcloth-wrapped packet from her pocket that held her charcoal pencils. He confiscated everything. "The maps are gone," she said, her voice hollow. "They were in my satchel, back at the post." "You have them here," he said, and he tapped his own temple. "You drew them. You will draw them again. You will draw them wrong." She stared at him, understanding. He was not just her captor. He was her new commander. I cannot remember it all." "You will remember," he said. "You will make him a new map, a map that leads him to dust and dry rock. You will fix what you have broken." He fell silent again, but the air was different. He was no longer the silent victim. He was a man with a plan, and she was, once again, a tool. Miles back, as the first gray hint of dawn touched the sky, Harlan Mott knelt by the muddy bank of the Rio Seco. The posse, drunk and discouraged, was still arguing on the far side, firing their rifles at shadows. Mott was not with them. He was a man of contracts, and his contract was with Colonel Pike. $50 in gold to find the Apache, 500 more to bring him in, dead or alive. He was not interested in the woman. He was interested in the tracks. He found them well north of the posse's crossing, the woman's small, slipping boot prints, and the tracks of the man. But he was looking for something else. He found it near a stand of rocks where a horse had been tied, a single, clear hoof print in the damp earth. The shoe was distinctive. It had a small notch, deliberately filed, on the outer edge of the left front shoe. It was a cavalry trick, one Naichi had learned and adapted. It made his trail easy to read, if you knew what you were looking for. Harlan Mott knew. He smiled, a thin, dry expression. He mounted his horse. He did not follow the river. He rode for the high ground, a lean shadow against the rising sun. By morning, the new decree from Tucson would be posted in the Dead Mule. A cavalry lieutenant had brought it himself, his uniform crisp, his face nervous. Any citizen found aiding, harboring, or failing to report a hostile Apache off the reservation would be subject to military arrest. Claire O'Rourke, huddled in a cave, her clothes frozen stiff, did not know it yet, but she was no longer a surveyor. She was an outlaw. He finally risked a small, smokeless fire built in the back of the cave, using dry juniper that burned hot and clean. The warmth was a miracle. It slowly, painfully, brought her back to life. Her thigh was a mass of dark purple. Her shoulder throbbed, but she was alive. He handed her a piece of dry bark and one of her charcoal pencils. "Draw." Her hands were stiff, clumsy with cold. She closed her eyes, forcing her surveyor's memory to work. She saw her own neat script, the elevation lines, the water level marks. She started to draw. She made a choice. She drew the main canyon. She drew the tributary streams. But she shifted the location of the deep pass. the one Pike needed for his dam. She moved it 2 miles to the north, to a wider, shallower part of the canyon. She drew a false fork in the river, one that led to a box canyon. She marked the water levels as inconsistent. It was a lie. A good lie. She handed the bark to him. "This is it. This is the way." He studied the crude map, his black eyes tracing the lines. He looked from the map to her face, and back again. She could not tell if he believed her. He folded the bark and tucked it inside his tunic. "You will make a better one," he said, "when you are warm, with your inks." It was a truce, a temporary bargain. It was the first act of atonement, a seed of loyalty planted in the barren soil of her guilt. As she huddled by the fire, the light caught his hand. He had cut it badly. A long, deep gash across his palm, probably on the rocks in the river. It was caked with mud and drying blood. He seemed to not underscore even notice it. Before she could think about what she was doing, she reached into the inner pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small, folded square of linen. It was old, soft from 100 washings, with a faded embroidered O in the corner. It had been her mother's. He moved when she did, his hand blurring to the knife at his belt. "Wait," she said, her voice soft. "Your hand. It is cut. It is bleeding." He looked at his own hand as if it were a strange object. "It is dirty," she said. She was practical. "It will fester." She held out the linen. He stared at it, then at her. His suspicion was a physical thing, a wall between them. "Please," she said. His eyes never left hers. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his wounded hand. She knelt in front of him. She took her canteen. He had taken it from her, but given it back, and poured a tiny, precious amount of water onto the linen. The cloth was stark white against the grime of the cave. Gently, her fingers moving with the same precision they used for her maps, she cleaned the wound. The cut was deep, right to the bone. He did not wince. He did not even breathe. He just watched her face. She folded the handkerchief into a pad, placed it over the cut, and then tore a strip from her own already ruined petticoat. She wrapped his hand, binding the linen in place. The white bandage was stark against his dark skin. He did not thank her. He did not speak at all. He just sat, looking at his bound hand. An exchange, a symbol of her old life, now given to him. A small, non-verbal promise. That night, they ate. He had disappeared for an hour and returned with 2 rabbits, slung over his shoulder. He had killed them without a sound. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence stretching. But it was not the angry, jagged silence of before. It was a stillness. Naichi took something from a hide bag. It was a simple flute, carved from a river reed. He put it to his lips. A melody filled the cave. It was not a white man's tune, with a clear beginning and end. It was the sound of the wind, the cry of a hawk, the sound of water running over stones. It was high and lonely and achingly beautiful. It was the sound of this land. Claire listened, and the knot of terror and guilt that had been sitting in her stomach for months began to unclench. Just a fraction. When he finished, the silence that returned was peaceful. "Who taught you that song?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at the fire, its light playing over the scar on his face. "My grandfather," he said. "Sanantan." He spoke, his voice low, telling the story more to the fire than to her. He told of his grandfather, a great chief who had been promised peace. He had been given a paper, a treaty, that promised him this land, these canyons, for as long as the rivers run. "The rivers are still running," Naichi said, his voice flat. He told how the men had come back, with a new paper. The old paper, they said, was gone. They had a new general. The old general was gone. They pushed his people from the lowlands, up into the high, barren rocks. "Sanantan went to talk," he said. "He asked only for the promise. The paper." He poked the fire with a stick. sending a shower of bright orange sparks into the darkness. "What happened?" Claire whispered. "They shot him." Nietzsche said, he said it simply, a fact, like a date on a calendar. "They shot him under a white flag of truce. They said he was a hostile. They said he was resisting." He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the flames. They were not the eyes of a young man. They were ancient, filled with the memory of 1,000 such betrayals. "We do not trust paper," he said. "We do not trust promises. We do not trust maps." Claire looked down at her hands, the hands that drew the maps. She finally understood. The clean, precise lines she drew for Pike were not geography. They were the white flag. They were the lie, told over and in a new, more clever language. And she was the one who had brought that lie to his sacred home. The silence of the cave did not follow them. The moment they stepped out into the brittle morning, the wind returned. A living, hostile thing. It tore at Claire's hair, which she had tried to braid with frozen fingers, and it filled her ears with a high, desolate shriek. Nietzsche moved ahead of her, his bound hand a stark white flash against the red rock. He had not spoken of his grandfather again. He had not spoken at all. He had simply given her a hunk of the cold rabbit meat and pointed his chin toward the pass. The climb was worse than the night before. Now she could see the 1,000-foot drops, the ledges no wider than her boot, the way the rock face was sheer and unforgiving. Her body was a map of new pains, the deep purple bruise on her thigh, her screaming shoulder, and the dull, throbbing cold in her bones. But a new shame fueled her. She was not just a victim. She was a conspirator. Her maps had been a betrayal, and the story of Sa Nan-tan had burned that truth into her. Nietzsche moved with a grace that was almost insulting. He was part of the rock, his moccasins finding holds that looked like mere shadows. He did not look back to see if she followed. He expected her to follow. They entered a place where the towering walls of the canyon squeezed together, forming a narrow, ascending slit of rock. The path was a ledge slick with green, treacherous moss and the spray of a waterfall that was more ice than water. The wind, funneled into this narrow chute, became a physical giant, pushing and pulling, trying to peel her from the wall. Claire, the woman who could measure mountains with her eye, froze. This was not a line on paper. This was a vertical grave. The wind shrieked, and a gust hit her, slamming her back against the rock. Her foot slipped on the slick stone. She looked down and saw only air, a sickening, dizzying drop to the canyon floor hundreds of feet below. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She could not move. She could not breathe. "I cannot," she gasped, her voice stolen by the wind. "I cannot." Nietzsche was already 10 yards ahead. He stopped. He turned. His impatience was a visible aura. He had no time for this. He was listening, not to her, but to the echoes in the canyon behind them. He came back for her. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak. He moved with a speed that was all business, and he grabbed her. His hand, the uninjured one, closed around her wrist like a steel trap. He pulled. The force of it, the sheer, unthinking power, sent a spike of pain from her wrist to her shoulder. It was too much. It was the same brute force as the raider at the post, the same blind power that saw her as an object to be moved. "You are hurting me," she moaned, the words torn from her, half a sob, half a gasp. He stopped, his body frozen. He was still holding her wrist, his knuckles white. The wind howled around them, a chorus to her pain. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. His eyes were not angry. They were a terrible, black, hollowed-out calm. He spoke through teeth that were barely parted, his voice a low, raw whisper that cut through the wind. "It is the only force I know." The words hung between them. It was not an excuse. It was a confession, a statement of fact as hard and as terrible as the stone beneath their feet. He knew nothing but the force that takes, the force that defends, the force that survives. He had learned it from a lifetime of war, a lifetime of pursuit, a lifetime of betrayal. And in that second, she saw a flicker in his eyes, a profound self-loathing. He hated the reflex in his own hand. He hated what the world had made him. His grip did not just loosen, it recoiled. He let go of her as if she were fire. She stumbled, clutching her wrist, her eyes wide, staring at him. He did not speak. He turned his back to her. A sharp, dismissive movement. But it was a movement to hide his face. He stood for a long moment, his shoulders rigid, facing the canyon wall. Then he reached to his belt, to a small pouch. He pulled out a thong of soft, smoked deer hide, the kind he used for bindings. He took her arm, his touch now so light it was barely a touch at all. He examined her wrist, which was already showing the red marks of his fingers. Without a word, he wrapped the soft leather strip around her wrist, a silent, primitive bandage. It was an apology. It was the only one he knew how to give. He turned from her, and in one fluid motion, he bent down. He pointed at her boot, which was snagged on a tangle of creosote, a long, needle-sharp spine from a cholla cactus. A jumping cactus was buried in the heel. She had not even felt it. He took his knife and, with two precise, quick movements, dug the spine from her boot leather. He did not wait for her thanks. He began to climb again, but this time, he moved slower. He pointed to the handholds. He waited for her to find her footing. The rest of the climb was in silence, but it was a new silence. She was no longer just his prisoner, a tool to be used. She was a woman whose wrist he had bound in soft leather. He was a man who hated the only force he knew. They emerged from the pass onto a high, sun-drenched mesa. The wind was still present, but it was a wide, clean wind, not the screaming demon of the Narrows. And the canyon opened up into a wide, green valley. It was a miracle. A river, clear and gentle, ran through a grove of cottonwood trees. Naichi relaxed, the tension leaving his shoulders. This was his home. Claire saw it, and her mapmaker's mind, the one that had been trained to see resource and grade, went silent. She saw a place that was alive. Naichi led her to a small, clear spring. He took a battered tin cup from his pack, filled it, and handed it to her. Then he knelt, and with his bare hands, he dug up the roots of a small, scrubby bush, the creosote plant. He crushed them, added them to his own cup of water, and then used a flint to spark a small, quick fire. He heated the water, and a sharp, resinous, but clean smell filled the air. It smelled like the desert after a rain. He handed her the warm, bitter tea. "It will help the pain," he said, nodding at her shoulder. She drank. The tea was terrible, but it was warm, and it was the first kindness she had received in a week. As she drank, her eyes fell on a sight that made her freeze. On a small rise overlooking the river, there was a pillar of stone. It was not natural. It was draped with offerings, strings of turquoise, small leather pouches, and bright feathers. At the base of the pillar was a wide, dark circle of black ash. It was not a campsite. "That is where the spirit leaves," Naichi said, his voice quiet. He had followed her gaze. "When the body is burned, that is the door to the next world." Claire looked from the pillar of ash to her own hands, the hands that had drawn a line for a railroad, a circle for a dam. The line Pike wanted ran directly through this spot. He was not just building a dam. He was drowning a church. He was flooding a cemetery. He was closing the door for their spirits. "I did not know," she whispered. "Now you do," he said. He was suddenly tense again. His head was cocked, listening. He rose in a single, silent motion and glided to the edge of the mesa, where he could look back down the canyon they had just climbed. He knelt, studying the trail. Claire followed, her heart suddenly pounding. He pointed. "He is here." She looked. She saw nothing but rocks and dust. "Who?" One man, on a horse. The horse wears iron shoes. 4 of them. He explained, his voice low and tight. His own pony, hidden miles away, wore no shoes. His people did not. The posse, they were shod. But this was one man, moving fast, not with the clumsy weight of a posse. He was a hunter. He does not follow the trail, Nietzsche said. He follows the line, the high line. He knows how to hunt. As if to prove his words, a sound drifted up from the canyon below. It was not the wind. It was not a hawk. It was a thin, metallic, cutting sound. A whistle. 2 short notes, then 1 long. Harlan Mott. Nietzsche's face was stone. The enemy was no longer a faceless posse miles behind. The enemy was here, in his sacred place. He was being hunted in his own home. He turned to her, and the time for soft leather and bitter tea was over. You, he said. Can you shoot? I can, she said. A little. I have a pistol for snakes. A snake pistol, he said, the corner of his mouth turning with a contempt that was almost a smile. No. He went to a small cache hidden under a flat rock. He pulled out a long bundle wrapped in hide. He unrolled it. It was a rifle. It was an old Spencer carbine. The wood scarred, the barrel worn, but the metal was clean, oiled. It was a soldier's gun, probably from a battle a decade ago. He pushed it into her hands. It was heavy, awkward, the smell of oil and old wood strange. He will come up the pass, Nietzsche said, or he will circle. He will expect me. He will not expect you. He took her, the rifle still in her hands, and positioned her behind a waist-high wall of rocks that overlooked the narrow pass. You will wait here. What will you do? I will be the rabbit, he said. He will follow me, but if he comes here, if he sees you, you must stop him. Stop him? You mean? She could not say it. He grabbed her hand, the one on the rifle's stock, and placed her finger on the trigger. You do not shoot to kill, he said, his voice hard, his eyes boring into hers. You shoot to stop. You shoot the horse. You shoot the ground in front of him. You shoot his arm. You do not shoot his heart. He was teaching her his own brutal, disciplined morality. He was teaching her to use force, but to control it. How? She asked, her voice shaking. How do I? You breathe, he said. He put his good hand on her stomach. Here, you make the world small. You make it just the sight. You pull the air in. He made her do it. You let the air out, slow, and then you squeeze. You do not pull, you squeeze. He was teaching her, in the shadow of his ancestors' graves, with a killer in the canyon. He was teaching her to shoot. He looked at her, a long, assessing look. You will not run. It was not a question. I will not run, she said, and you will not draw for him again. I promise, she said. I swear it, on my mother's grave. I will not draw for Pike. He nodded. He seemed to accept this. He reached into his tunic. He pulled out 2 items. One was a small, beautifully beaded amulet, worn and dark with age. His mother's amulet. The other was her brass compass, which he had taken from her. He held them both in his palm, the sacred and the profane, the old world and the new. He looked at her. Then he placed her compass on the rock wall beside her, next to the beaded amulet. He did not separate them. He set them side by side. The way home, he said, touching the amulet. And the way in. He touched her compass. Now they are the same. He turned, and without another sound, he was gone. A red-brown shadow moving down the rocks, heading away from her, to draw the hunter away from the heart of the valley. Harlan Mott was a ghost. He did not come up the pass. He did not circle. For 2 days, there was only the wind, the cry of the high hawks, and the grinding, brittle silence of the rocks. Nietzsche and Claire moved, never staying in one place for more than a few hours, living on bitter roots and the last of the rabbit. The hunter's presence was a cold weight on the air, Naichi was being outweighted. Then, on the third morning, the wind died. It did not taper off. It simply stopped, as if the world had taken a deep breath and held it. The silence that fell was profound, unnatural, and heavy. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue, turned a sickly, yellowish-brown. Naichi, who had been balanced on a rock, went completely still. He looked at the sky, then at the ground. He sniffed the air. It smelled of dust and something ancient, something burnt. "It comes," he said, his voice low. "What does the wind, the real wind?" He grabbed her arm, his touch still rough, but no longer cruel. It was urgent. "We must find a deep place." They ran. They scrambled down a rock slide, their boots and moccasins dislodging stones. And for half a mile, they followed a dry, sandy wash. The yellow light grew darker. The air became so thick it was hard to breathe, the grit coating her teeth. The world was holding its breath. Then the breath was released. It came as a low moan from the south, a sound that became a roar, a sound that became the voice of an angry god. A solid wall of red dust, 1,000 feet high, blotted out the sun. It was not a storm. It was the end of the world. "Here!" he yelled over the rising shriek. He pulled her toward a black slash in the rock, a shallow cave, barely a hollow, its mouth half hidden by a dead juniper. They dove inside, scrambling on hands and knees. Just as the main force of the storm hit, it did not hit, it swallowed. The sun vanished. The world outside the cave mouth was gone, replaced by a solid, screaming, churning red-black. Sand and small pebbles, driven like bullets, blasted the entrance. The sound was a physical weight, a continuous deafening roar that vibrated in her bones. Naichi pushed her to the back of the cave, which was not deep, perhaps 10 feet. He put his body between her and the entrance, his back to the storm, and covered his head with his arms. They stayed that way for a long time, hours. The temperature dropped. The air in the cave became thick with fine, choking dust that found its way past any defense. It was a living, suffocating thing. When the roar finally subsided, it was full dark. The wind still shrieked, but it was a wind now, not a solid object. They were trapped. A dune of fine, red sand, shoulder high, had formed at the cave entrance. They had one canteen, half full. They had no food. They waited. The storm raged for a day. It raged for 2, or perhaps 3. Time, once again, smeared. It became a measure of thirst, a dull, aching hunger, and the maddening, claustrophobic darkness. The silence between them was no longer a truce. It was a shared prison. On the second day, or perhaps it was the third, Claire's mind began to fray. The darkness, the hunger, the fine grit that was now in her lungs, her eyes, her very soul. It all conspired. She was not in a cave. She was back in the Dead Mule, at the auction. She was a piece of property, her value calculated in debt. Naichi had saved her. He had fed her. He had bound her wrist and taught her to shoot. He had, in his own way, been kind. In the sick, twisted logic of the world she had come from, this kindness was a debt. It was a contract. Naichi sat cross-legged, his back to her, watching the still raging curtain of sand. He was utterly still, a statue of pure, starving patience. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, cracked thing, a stranger's voice. "Naichi!" He did not turn. I can pay you," she whispered. He stiffened. The line of his back went rigid. "Pay me," he said, his voice flat. "For what? For saving me, for the food, for this." She was so thirsty. Her mind was a fog of dust and shame. She was back at the post, where there was only one currency a woman held. "I have no money. You know that. Slate took it. But I can—" She fumbled with the buttons of her dusty coat, her fingers clumsy. "I can pay the debt. like the other women. Naichi turned, and it was a slow, terrible movement. His eyes, in the red-tinged darkness of the cave, were not human. They were pits. He looked at her fumbling hands, at the fear and the shame on her face. He did not move. He did not speak. The silence that stretched was more violent than the storm. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud. It was a sound of such cold, profound fury that it physically pushed her back. "No." The word was a stone. "I am not Slate," he said, his voice a low, shaking growl. "I am not Pike. I am not one of them." He crawled the few feet that separated them, and she flinched, but he did not stop. He loomed over her, his face inches from hers. "You think what you have," he motioned to her body, "is a debt you think it is a coin." He was furious, but she saw again, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that the fury was not for her. It was for the world that had taught her this. It was for Slate and Pike and the men who had put those empty, punched-out eyes in the woman at the auction. "When you want," he hissed, his voice raw. "Not when you owe." He stood, a violent, jerky movement in the cramped space. "We are not them." He turned his back on her, a gesture of finality. He took the heavy, wool-lined cloak he used for sleeping, the one he had been sitting on. He did not offer it. He threw it at her. It landed on her, heavy and smelling of him, of smoke and dust and man. "Cover yourself," he commanded. "It is cold." He then did the one thing she could not have predicted. He walked to the mouth of the cave. He sat down, his back to her, his face to the storm. He did not huddle. He sat upright, his arms crossed, a dark, defiant silhouette against the screaming, sand-blasted entrance. He sat there all night. He took the full force of the wind, the sand, the cold, while she lay in the protected dark, wrapped in his warmth. It was a penance, and it was a rejection, and it was the most profound act of respect she had ever been shown. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind was gone. The world was remade, a new landscape of soft, red dunes under a clean, cold sky. They were both weak, their bodies hollowed by hunger. Naichi was covered in a fine layer of red dust, his face gaunt, but he stood and offered her the canteen. She drank. He drank. They left the cave. They found water that day, a small seep he uncovered by digging at the base of a rock. They ate cattail roots, a stringy, bitter meal. They were alive. That night, they risked a fire. Exhaustion, total and complete, claimed her. She fell asleep by the small, warm flames. And she dreamed. She was not in the canyon. She was at the post, on the platform. Slate was holding her hair, his wet voice shouting her debt. Pike was there, his uniform pristine, pointing, handing gold to Harlan Mott. And the man who had grabbed her, the fake Apache, was pulling her into the fire. She screamed, a thin, terrified sound, ripped from her throat. She woke to a hand on her shoulder. She screamed again, lashing out, striking something hard. "Claire!" It was Naichi's voice, low and urgent. She blinked, the firelight stinging her eyes. He was kneeling over her, his face a mask of concern. His hand was on her shoulder, and he was frozen. She had struck his hand, the one she had bandaged. He was staring at it, and at his other hand, which was still on her shoulder. His grip tight, she realized, clenching his jaw, his muscles corded. "You are," she whispered, her heart hammering. "I am stopping," he said, and the words were ripped from him. He was holding himself in check, his entire body rigid with the effort of not using the force he knew. He was trying to be gentle, and the effort was a physical agony for him. He released her, pulling his hands back as if from a fire. He sat back on his heels, his chest rising and falling. He had wanted to comfort her, and his first, Last and only instinct was to grab, to hold, to force, and he had stopped himself. He did not touch her again. He moved back to his side of the fire, a safe distance away. He sat and watched her. "It was a dream," she said, her voice shaking, pulling her coat around her. "I know," he said. He did not offer platitudes. He did not say it was all right. He simply picked up his reed flute. He did not play a song. He began to speak, his voice a low, quiet rumble, telling a story into the fire. It was not a personal story. It was a legend of the coyote, the trickster, a story of how the mountains were formed. It was impersonal. It was calm. It was a sound that had nothing to do with her nightmare. He spoke, his voice a steady, unchanging rhythm, and she listened. She listened to the story, and to the silence between the words, and slowly, the hammering in her chest slowed. The images of Slate and Pike faded. She lay back, her eyes on the fire, and she let the sound of his voice, the sound of the ancient, impersonal legend, pull her back from the edge. He talked until her breathing was slow and even. He talked her back to sleep. The next day, they climbed. They had to know. They had to see what the storm had done to the land and what their enemies had done. They reached a high, narrow ridge, a spine of rock that overlooked the main entrance to the valley, the one she had marked on Pike's map. The air was clean, washed by the storm. They could see for 50 miles, and they saw them, far below, not even a mile from the sacred burial ground. A camp was being built. It was not a large camp, a dozen men, a score of mules. But it was an efficient camp. Claire watched, her surveyor's eye assessing. She saw a supply wagon, a canvas tent, and men. They were not soldiers. They were rough, hard men, and they were working. They were hammering thick wooden stakes into the ground. They were using tripods and transits. They were marking a line. A man in a crisp, dark coat stood apart, pointing, Colonel Beauregard Pike. As they watched, a small group of men moved to the canyon wall. They placed something. A long, thin fuse was lit. They ran. A moment later, a sound, flat and hard, echoed up the canyon. A sound that was not thunder, a puff of smoke and rock dust. They were using dynamite. They were blasting a path. They were setting the markers for the dam. Naichi made a sound, a low, guttural noise. He half rose, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. His eyes were on the men below, a burning, murderous focus. "No," Claire said, putting her hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, but he stopped. "You cannot," she said, her voice urgent. "Look at them. They are a dozen. They have dynamite. They have rifles. You would be dead before you took 2 steps. They are digging in the graves of my people," he hissed. "And if you attack, you will prove them right," she said, the logic coming to her, cold and fast. "You will be the savage they all say you are. They will call it a massacre, and they will bring the army. This is what Pike wants. He wants you to attack." He stared at her, his rage battling with her words. "The fire," she said, thinking quickly. "The raid at the post. That was the lie. We have to fight the lie, not the men, not yet." "How?" he growled. "We show them. We show the town. The cartridge casings, the brand on the saddle. Pike's brand." She thought of the people she had met, the few faces that were not hard. Jed Stone, the blacksmith. He is an honest man. He shod my mule. He spoke of you with respect. And Lola. What happened to Lola? We have to find her. They are the proof." Naichi was silent. He looked at the blasting camp, a scar of white canvas and human industry against the sacred red rock. He looked at the puff of smoke. Then he looked at her. He was a warrior. His instinct was to fight, to protect, to kill. She was offering another way, a harder way, a more dangerous way. "We would have to go back," he said. "Not to the post, near it. We need to find Jed. We need to get a message to him. And to Lola, if she is there." Naichi nodded. A single, sharp, decisive movement. The warrior had become a strategist. "We will," he said. "We will show them the truth. Then we will show them war." They camped that night. The air between them had changed for good. They were no longer captor and captive. They were not man and woman. They were not Apache and white. They were a conspiracy. They were a single, two-person war council. They ate the last of the roots. The fire was low. Naichi checked his knife. He checked his bow. Then he picked up the Spencer rifle. He looked at it. He looked at her. He pushed it across the small fire, offering it to her. "Stock first. You will take the watch," he said. Claire stared at the gun. It was his only firearm. It was his best weapon. It was his defense against Harlan Mott, against Pike, against the world. She took it. The wood was smooth in her hands. "What will you do?" she asked. "I will sleep," he said. And he did. He rolled onto his side, his back to her, his bound hand tucked under his head. He closed his eyes. He was making himself vulnerable, not just to the night, but to her. He was giving her the power, the weapon, and the choice. It was the greatest trust he could give, and it was heavier than the rifle. The rifle was a heavy, cold promise. Claire held it all night, her back against the rock, and listened to the two sounds that now defined her world: the steady, sleeping breath of the man who trusted her, and the high, thin wind that carried the souls of his ancestors. Naichi did not stir. He slept the sleep of a man who had given his fate to another, a profound and total surrender that was more intimate than any touch. When dawn came, cold and gray, he awoke. He simply opened his eyes, his body alert in an instant. He looked at her, then at the Spencer rifle she still held. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture. The trust had been offered and accepted. They moved. Their plan was desperate, born of a shared, cold fury. They had to expose Pike. To do that, they needed two things: proof and a witness who would listen. The proof was at the dead mule, in the form of shell casings and Pike's brand on the Raiders' gear. The witness was Jed Stone. But first, they had to get there, and they were still being hunted. "He is still here," Naichi said, his voice a low rumble as he studied the land. "The hunter, Mott." "He will be between us and the post," Claire said, her surveyor's mind clicking, seeing the map, the lines of probable movement. "Yes," Naichi said. "He will wait on the high ground, where the land funnels. He thinks I am predictable. He thinks I will run for the rocks." "And will you?" Naichi's mouth tightened in a way she was beginning to recognize. It was not a smile. It was the anticipation of a very hard, very cold joke. "We will not run from him," he said. "We will pull him. We will lead him to our own ground. You have your false map in your head." "I do," she said. "We will lead him to the place you drew for Pike, the Box Canyon, the place of dust and dry rock. We will lead him to Sand Pass." They traveled for a full day, moving southeast, away from the high green sanctuary of the valley and down into the barren, wind-scoured lowlands. It was a calculated risk. They were leaving the safety of the sacred ground, but they were also drawing the hunter away from it. Naichi made no effort to hide their trail. He let their footprints be clear in the sand, a clear invitation. Sand Pass was a gash in a line of sandstone mesas, a dry, wide arroyo with high, crumbling walls. It was a perfect trap. The wind, as Naichi had predicted, howled through it, a steady, deafening roar that blew toward them, masking any sound they might make. "He will come from the south," Naichi said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "He will have the wind at his back, and he thinks that makes him silent. He does not know this wind. This wind carries sound. It does not kill it. He will be loud." He pointed to a high ledge, 30 feet up the canyon wall, hidden by a curtain of dry, dead vines. "You will be there. You will be his sky." He handed her the Spencer. "Wait for my sound." "What sound?" He looked at her, his eyes flat. "You will know it." He left her. She climbed, her legs shaking, her shoulder aching. and found the ledge. She was a sniper. The thought was so absurd, so foreign that she almost laughed. Claire O'Rourke, the woman who drew flowers and measured streams, was now holding a carbine, waiting to kill a man. No, she thought, her fingers tightening on the wooden stock. Not to kill, to stop. She waited. The wind was a physical thing, pushing at her, filling her ears, numbing her face. She waited for an hour, then 2, then she saw them. They were 4 riders, moving at a slow, careful walk. They were not Apache. They were white men dressed in a mix of army surplus and miner's gear. And at their lead, on a tall bay horse, was Harlan Mott. He was exactly as Nietzsche had described a professional. He sat his horse with a lean, patient grace, his rifle held easily across his saddle. They were Pike's hunting team. They stopped at the mouth of the pass. Mott held up a hand. He was cautious. He dismounted, knelt, and studied the tracks. He looked up, his eyes sweeping the ridges. Claire pressed herself so far back into the rock she thought she would merge with it. Mott eventually nodded, satisfied. He pointed into the pass. He remounted. They rode in. The canyon was narrow, their horses kicking up small clouds of sand. The wind screamed. Claire held her breath. She raised the rifle. Mott stopped. He raised his head, sniffing the air. He had heard something, or sensed something. He was good, but Nietzsche was better. A high, piercing cry cut through the wind. It was not a man. It was a red-tailed hawk, a perfect, predatory call. It was Nietzsche's sound. An arrow, silent as the wind itself, appeared in the throat of the last rider. The man made no sound. He simply slumped forward and slid from his horse. Before the others could turn, Nietzsche was there. He was not in the pass. He was above them, on the opposite rim. "Mott!" he roared, his voice a challenge. Mott reacted instantly. He was not a fool. He dove from his horse, rolling behind the animal's body, bringing his rifle up. The other 2 men panicked. They drew their pistols, firing wildly at the cliffs. "He is up there! Get him!" one shouted. Then, a new sound. A fuse. One of the men, one of Pike's men, had a canvas bag. He pulled a stick of dynamite from it, the same kind they were using at the dam site. He lit the fuse, his hands shaking. "Here!" he screamed, and he threw it. The stick bounced on the rocks, rolled, and exploded. The sound was a solid blow. It was not like thunder. It was a sharp, cracking, godless noise. The canyon walls shook. Rock and dust rained down. Claire felt the vibration in her teeth, in her bones. It was the sound of Pike's world, the sound of iron and progress. And it was a violation. The explosion panicked the horses. They screamed and reared. Nietzsche was gone, vanished from the rim. Harlan Mott was calm. He was on one knee, his horse a shield, and he was scanning the rocks. He knew Nietzsche was moving. Nietzsche appeared at the far end of the pass, on the ground, running, drawing their fire. Mott did not hesitate. He was a professional. He tracked Nietzsche's movement. He breathed, made the world small, and squeezed. The shot was flat and clean. Nietzsche grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and stumbled. Grabbing his left shoulder, he fell behind a line of boulders. Mott had hit him. Claire's world narrowed. The wind, the dust, the shouting men had all disappeared. There was only Nietzsche, hurt, and the man who had hurt him. Mott stood, moving to get a clearer shot, a clearer angle on the boulders. His horse, trained and calm, stood by him. Claire put the rifle stock to her shoulder. It was heavy. She found Mott in her sights. "Do not shoot to kill. Shoot to stop." She saw the man. She saw the horse. She lowered her aim. She aimed at the horse's chest. It was a huge, unmissable target. It was a living thing. "I am sorry," she whispered. She breathed in. She let the air out slowly. She squeezed. The Spencer bucked, slamming into her shoulder. A new agony on top of the old. Below, the bay horse screamed. A terrible, high-pitched sound. It reared, its front legs buckling, and crashed to the ground. A ton of falling meat and bone. It fell backwards. Onto Harlan Mott. He screamed. A different sound. A sharp, angry cry of pain as his leg was crushed under the animal's weight. The fight was not over. The other two men were still there. Naichi exploded from behind the rocks. He was not a man. He was a force of nature. His shoulder was bleeding. A dark, wet patch on his tunic. But he did not slow. He had his knife. He was on the first man before the man could raise his pistol. It was not a kill. It was a disabling. He cut the man's hamstring. The man went down, screaming. The second man, the one with the dynamite, fumbled for another stick. Naichi was on him. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted. There was a wet, heavy snap of bone. Naichi stepped back. He was breathing hard. He was covered in dust and his own blood. He looked at the two men writhing on the ground. He looked at Mott, who was trapped and cursing. He had not killed any of them. He had stopped them. He walked to Mott. He pulled the man's rifle from where it had fallen. He walked to the dead horse. Mott stopped cursing and watched him. His eyes narrow, his face pale with pain. Naichi raised his knife. His face was a mask of cold, tribal fury. This was the man who had hunted him. This was the man who had shot him. This was Pike's man. Naichi, no! Claire was scrambling down the rocks, the Spencer still in her hand. Wait, we need him. He is the proof. Naichi paused. The knife was steady in his hand. The bloodlust was on him. A hot, red tide. He wanted this. He wanted to use the force. We need him alive, she said, reaching the canyon floor. He is the one who can tell the town. He is Pike's man. Naichi looked from her to Mott. He looked at the bleeding men. He was shaking, the adrenaline and the rage fighting for control. He lowered the knife. He grabbed Mott by the collar and, with a single brutal yank of his good arm, pulled the man's crushed leg free from the horse. Mott gasped, his face going white. Naichi did not care. He dragged him to the canyon wall and, using pigging string from Mott's own saddle, tied his hands. He tied the other two men. They were prisoners. They were evidence. It was in that moment of victory, that brief, terrible silence after the violence, that Naichi saw it. He looked up, past Claire, past the mouth of the pass, toward the north, toward the sacred valley. A thin column of smoke. It was not a campfire. It was too dark, too thick. It was rising high in the clean air. No, he whispered. He turned and scrambled up the canyon wall, his wounded shoulder forgotten. He climbed to the rim, where he could see. Claire followed him, her heart a cold stone. From the rim, they could see. The smoke was coming from the valley, from the sacred place, from the burial ground. Pike was not reacting to their fight. He was acting on his own. While they were busy with the hunter, Pike was busy with his own war. The ceremonial lodge, the one made of wood and skins, the one near the pillar of stone, was on fire. It was a funeral pyre, a bright, ugly, orange flame against the red rock. Naichi made a sound. It was not a word. It was a roar of such profound, animalistic grief and rage that Claire stumbled back. This was the true violation. This was the breaking of the world. He turned. His eyes were not his own. They were black, empty, and filled with a blind, murderous light. He slid down the rocks, his feet dislodging stones. He landed in the canyon and strode toward the prisoners. He strode toward Harlan Mott. He pulled his knife. This was not a question. This was not a test. This was an execution. Naichi! Claire screamed. He did not hear her. He raised the knife over the bound. Helpless hunter. She ran to him. She did not grab his arm. She knew she could not stop him. She did the only thing she could. She put her hand on his, the good one, the one holding the knife. No. She put her hand on his other hand, his left hand, the one she had bound in her mother's linen. "Naichi," she whispered, her voice breaking. Do not become him. This is what he wants." "This is the force he knows, not you." He froze. His entire body was a single, rigid line of tension. He was shaking so hard the knife blade vibrated. He stared at her hand, the pale skin against his own, against the white, stained bandage. He looked at the burning lodge in the distance. He looked at the bound man at his feet. He let out a breath, a long, ragged, tearing sound. It was the sound of a man pulling his own soul back from a cliff edge. He lowered the knife. He turned away from Mott. He walked to the canyon wall and hit it. Once, with his closed, bandaged fist. It was in that moment, that second of inattention, that it happened. The man with the broken arm, the one they had ignored, was not so broken. He had a knife in his boot. He had been working at his bonds. He cut them. He saw Mott. He saw Naichi's back. He did not fight. He was one of Pike's men. He was paid to be loyal. He scrambled, cutting Mott's ropes. "Go!" he hissed. Mott was a professional. He was in agony, but he was a professional. He stood, his legs screaming, and he ran. He and the henchman grabbed the 2 remaining horses, the ones that had not bolted. "Naichi!" Claire shouted, pointing. Naichi turned. He was too late. The 2 men were galloping out of the pass. A frantic, desperate retreat. Mott, in his haste, his leg on fire, had lost his saddlebag. It had been cut loose by the fall. It lay in the dust, next to his dead horse. Naichi raised his rifle, but they were gone. He stood, defeated, bleeding, watching the dust. The lodge was burning. The hunters had escaped. Claire walked, her legs numb, to the saddlebag. She picked it up. It was heavy. She opened it. Inside, along with ammunition, a skinning knife, and a plug of tobacco, was a folded piece of paper. It was one of her sketches, a small, precise self-portrait she had done in Santa Fe. Testing her charcoal, she turned it over. There was writing on the back, in Pike's neat, sloping hand. It read, $200, alive. To me, he had not just put a price on Naichi. He had put a price on her. She was no longer a renegade tool. She was a liability, a captive. The smoke from the burning lodge choked the sky. Naichi walked back to her. His rage was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying emptiness. "He will go back to the canyon," he said, his voice flat. "He will tell Pike we are here, that we are armed. Pike will move. He will blast the pass. He will dynamite the graves. He will say we did it." It was a perfect trap. "He will blame us for the fire he started," Claire whispered, her hand crushing the sketch. "They will all believe him." Naichi said. They stood in the dust, surrounded by their failed proof. They had 2 wounded, useless prisoners. They were on foot, they were bleeding, and the enemy was now warned. "We cannot go back to the valley," Naichi said. "We cannot stay here." Claire answered. She looked south, toward the post, toward the town that hated them both. "We have to go," she said, her voice hard, the decision made. "We have to go now. We have to run to them. We have to tell the truth to the liars. It is the only way." They did not go back to the valley. The smoke was a black scar against the sky, a monument to their failure. They left the 2 wounded, bound men in the canyon. Naichi, in a final act of his own complex code, left them with a full canteen of water. "They will be found by their own," he said, his voice as flat and dead as the burned lodge. The journey back to the dead mule trading post was a descent into a new kind of hell. They were on foot, with 1 rifle, no food, and a half-full canteen. Naichi was bleeding. The bullet from Mott's rifle had torn through the flesh of his shoulder, a deep, gouging wound that he refused to let her inspect properly. He had packed it with moss and bound it with a strip of his own tunic, but he was weakening. He was pale beneath his dark skin, and he moved with a stiff, painful deliberation. But he did not stop. Claire was beyond exhaustion. Her body was a single, dull ache, but her mind was sharp, cold, and clear. The self-portrait with Pike's handwriting was tucked into her shirt, a piece of paper that felt as hot as a coal. $200. Alive. To me, she was a commodity, a piece of Pike's puzzle, and she was done being a pawn. They traveled for 2 days, moving only at night, hiding in washes and rock crevices during the searing, sunlit hours. They ate nothing, they spoke little. The silence was a shared weight, a bond forged in desperation. On the 3rd night, they reached the bluff overlooking the trading post. It was a smear of yellow, feverish light in the vast, cold darkness. The saloon was loud. A piano, badly out of tune, was being hammered. "They are celebrating," Nietzsche whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. He was leaning against the rock, his good arm braced, the wounded one held tight to his chest. "They are celebrating the fire," Claire said. "They are celebrating Pike's victory." "We cannot wait," he said. "The smith, Jed Stone, you must find him. I will wait here. You are hurt. You cannot stay here alone." "I have been more hurt and more alone," he said. He gave her the Spencer. "He will not shoot a woman, probably." She left him in the shadows, a decision that felt like tearing a piece of her own body away. She stumbled down the dark, familiar path, the rifle a heavy, useless weight. She did not go to the main square. She cut behind the livery, her feet silent in the dust, her senses screaming. The smithy was dark, but the forge was still warm. The smell of coal smoke and hot iron hung in the air. She tapped on the heavy wooden door. Jed Stone." A light flickered inside. The door opened a crack. Jed Stone's face, broad and honest, peered out. His eyes were wary. "Miss O'Rourke, my God, we thought—" "Slate said the Apache had—" "He did," she said, cutting him off, her voice low and desperate. "He saved my life, and he is dying. Please, you are the only one." He looked at her, a long, searching look. He saw her torn clothes, the desperation in her eyes, the Apache rifle in her hands. He was a man who worked with iron. He knew the difference between a clean line and a bad weld. He opened the door. "Bring him in." She ran back, her heart a hammer. She found Nietzsche where she had left him, slumped against the rock. He was barely conscious. "He is here," she whispered. "I am not," he said, but he allowed her to put her good arm over his shoulder, and together they half stumbled, half ran the last 100 yards. Jed pulled them both into the smithy, the sound of the bar sliding home a final, definitive thud. The smithy was a cavern of shadows, tools, and the smell of horses. Jed lit a lantern. "He is in my forge," he said, nodding to a pile of clean straw in the back, hidden behind the great bellows. "No one will look there." He helped her get Nietzsche settled. He brought water. He brought a clean cloth. His shoulder. Claire said. Jed Stone looked at the wound. "That is a .44, he said, his voice flat. "That is a white man's bullet. It was Harlan Mott," she said. Jed's face darkened. "He has been here, bragging. He and Pike's men. They rescued the Sonora woman, Lola." Claire's head snapped up. "Lola?" "She is here. Is she safe?" "Safe enough," Jed said bitterly. "Pike has her in a room at the post. Protective custody. She has not spoken a word to anyone. She just sits and waits. She is the witness." Claire said. "We are all witnesses." Jed said. "To a damn thing we cannot prove. We can prove it." Claire said. "Jed, the raid, the fake one, the raiders." "One of them fell. He left his saddle. Did you find it?" Jed looked at her, his eyes widening. "In the livery, the burned part. Slate told me to clear it. I found it. A fancy saddle. It had a brand, a P in a circle. Pike's brand," Claire said, her voice shaking with a cold triumph. "Where is it?" "In the scrap heap. I was going to strip it for the leather." "Get it," she said. "And the cartridge shells. Did you find any?" "Oh, dozens. Army issue. .4440. Get them." The morning was bright, cold, and clear. The town was slow to wake. At 9 o'clock, Jed Stone walked into the square. He was carrying the burned, branded saddle. Claire O'Rourke walked beside him. She was clean, her hair brushed, wearing a spare shirt Jed had given her. She looked calm. They walked to the center of the square, by the main water trough. Jed dropped the saddle on the ground with a thud. Barnaby Slate was the first to see them. He was sweeping his porch. He stopped. His muddy eyes went from Claire to Jed to the saddle. His oily smile was in place before he took 2 steps. Miss O'Rourke, a miracle returned from the dead, and the savage. He is not a savage, Claire said, her voice carrying in the still morning air. People were stopping. A miner, a teamster, 2 women from the laundry. He saved my life from these men. She held up a handful of the heavy, brass-colored shells. Does the Apache use army ammunition? Mr. Slate. What? What is this? Slate said, his smile faltering. This, Jed Stone said, his voice a blacksmith's roar, is a lie. We were told there was an Apache raid. We were told they burned my livery, but the men who burned it wore these. He kicked the saddle. This is the brand of Pike's Railroad security. The same men who are up in the canyon, blasting rock, claiming they are protecting us. A crowd was gathering. 20 people, 30. That is a lie, a new voice shouted. Colonel Beauregard Pike strode into the square. He was not alone. He had 10 men with him, all in dark uniforms, all carrying rifles. Harlan Mott was among them, his leg bandaged, his face a smug, painful mask. This woman, Pike said, his voice a steel whip, is a spy. She was working for me, and she betrayed her contract. She consorted with the native hostile, Naichi. She gave him information. She incited him. She is responsible for the death of my men in Sand Pass. She is an accessory to murder. He pointed at her. Arrest her? 2 of Pike's men moved forward. Grabbing Claire's arms, Jed Stone stepped in front of her. You will not! Pike laughed. He unholstered his pistol and aimed it, very calmly, at Jed's chest. Step aside, blacksmith. This is a military matter. This territory is under my protection. Is it? The voice came from the smithy. It was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. Naichi walked out of the shadows of the forge. He was unarmed. His hands were empty, held loosely at his sides. He wore Jed's clean shirt, the white linen stark against his dark skin. The bandage on his shoulder was a dark, seeping red. His black hair was unbound. He walked, with a slow, deliberate limp, into the center of the square. The crowd gasped. Women crossed themselves. Men's hands went to their pistols. Apache, someone whispered. Naichi stopped. He stood 10 feet from Pike. He looked at the crowd. He let them see him. He let them see the famous scar. He let them see the fresh bullet wound. This, Naichi said, his voice clear and resonant, is what a white man's bullet does. He looked at Pike. You have been hunting me, and now I am here. Your hunt is over, but you will speak the truth first. The truth, Pike sneered. Though his eyes were wary, he still had his pistol on Jed. The truth is, you are a savage who burns and kidnaps. You burned my men's camp. You, Naichi said, burned my home. Lies, Slate shouted from the porch. He is a liar. No, a woman's voice, a shriek. Lola Esquivel ran from the post, her hair wild. She ran and stood, shaking, between Naichi and Pike. He is not the liar, she cried, pointing at Pike's men. They are, the night of the fire, the Apache who took me. He wore boots, thick boots, like him, and him. She pointed at 2 of Pike's mercenaries. I heard them. They did not speak Apache. They spoke English. They said, get the woman. Pike needs a reason. A profound, deathly silence fell on the square. Naichi broke it. He pointed, not at the saddle, but at the rifles Pike's men were holding. Look, he said to the crowd. Look at their guns. At the wood. The mark. The townsfolk looked. On the stock of every rifle was the same small, carved brand, the P, inside a circle. The snake. The same mark. Jedstone roared, holding up the burned saddle. The same mark. It was a setup. The crowd turned. They were not a mob. They were a jury. And they were looking at Pike with a new, cold anger. Pike saw it. He saw the tide turn. He smiled. It was a terrible, thin smile. "You are right," he said. "This is a matter for the town. We will have a trial." He holstered his pistol. "A trial," he said. "For the Apache spy, Claire O'Rourke, and for the murdering hostile, Naichi. We will have a trial, and we will have a hanging." He turned to his men. "Build a gallows, right here, in the square. I want it done by morning." He looked at Slate. "You go write your story. Justice in the territory. Make it a good one." Slate's eyes lit up. He saw a prophet. He ran inside. "Jedstone," Pike said, "you are under arrest for harboring a fugitive." He nodded to Harlan Mott. "Mr. Mott, see to our prisoners." Mott, his face a mask of smug satisfaction, limped forward. He was enjoying this. "My pleasure, Colonel. Always wanted to bring this one in myself." He was playing his own game. He got his reward from Pike, and he got the personal satisfaction of capturing the man who had outsmarted him. He grabbed Naichi's good arm. Pike's men grabbed Claire and Jed. They were not put in the jail. Pike did not trust the local marshal. He marched them back to the smithy and threw them into the heavy iron-barred storage shed where Jed kept his coal and iron bars. It was a cage. The heavy door slammed. The bar dropped. They were alone. The three of them. In the dark. With the sounds of the town outside, the curious murmurs. Slate's shouting about his special edition broadsheet, and the first terrible sound of a saw cutting fresh pine. They were building the gallows. Jedstone sank to the floor, his head in his hands. "We are dead." "Maybe," Claire said. She sat in the straw, her body finally succumbing to the cold and the exhaustion. Naichi did not sit. He stood, his wounded shoulder against the bars, staring out into the dark smithy. "He will not kill us," Naichi said. "He is building the gallows." "Chief," Jed said, his voice muffled. "He will not let a court kill us," Naichi corrected. "He will not risk a trial. He will not risk us speaking." He looked at Claire. "Mott, he is not Pike's man. He is his own man. He wanted me. He did not want this." The saw cut through the night. Hours passed. Jed fell into a fitful, snoring sleep. Claire and Naichi were alone in the dark. "You were right," she whispered. "My map. It was a white flag. It was the lie." "I was right," he said. "About the Force, the only one I know. When I saw the smoke, I wanted to kill him. I wanted to be the savage he said I was." "You stopped," she said. "You stopped me," he corrected. He turned from the bars and slid down to the floor, sitting a few feet from her. His breathing was shallow. The wound was bad. "I am afraid," she said, the confession a small, cold thing in the dark. He was silent for a long time. "I am also," he said. "I am not afraid to die. I am afraid." He looked at her, his eyes just shadows in the dark. "I am afraid to die for his lie, in a cage, with my feet off the earth." She crawled the few feet, her hand brushing his. "Naichi," he did not pull away. "If we get out of this," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "If we live, I do not know what." "I know," he said. His good hand found hers in the darkness. Not a caress, not a grasp of force, but just a covering. His skin was hot with fever, but his hand was steady. "If we live," he said, "you will owe me nothing. I will owe you nothing." She understood. She put her other hand on top of his. "We will choose," she said. "We will choose." He agreed. Outside, the hammer blows on the gallows rang into the night, counting down the hours. The dawn was not a dawn. It was a cold, gray sickness in the sky. The sound of the hammering had stopped, replaced by a low, expectant murmur from the town. The gallows stood in the center of the square, a raw, ugly skeleton of new pine, its shadow long and stark in the morning light. Pike's men came for them at 8 o'clock. They were led by Harlan Mott, who seemed to be enjoying himself, his limp a theatrical, painful-looking accessory. "Time for the show," Mott said. Unlocking the heavy bar, they dragged Jed Stone out first, his face a mask of dark, hopeless rage. They took Claire next. She walked with her head high, her eyes scanning the square. The townsfolk were there, all of them, their faces pale and curious in the cold. They were not a lynch mob. They were a nervous, silent audience. Last, they brought Naichi. His wound had bled through the white shirt, a huge, dark stain. He was feverish. She could see it in the bright, hard glaze of his eyes. But he walked, not as a prisoner, but as a chief, his gaze fixed, not on the gallows, but on something far beyond the town, toward his burning valley. Pike was on the platform, dressed in his crisp uniform, a document in his hand. Barnaby's slate was beside him, a notebook at the ready. "People of the Arizona Territory," Pike began, his voice booming in the silence. "We are here for justice. This man, Naichi, a hostile, and this woman, Claire O'Rourke, his accomplice, have been found guilty of sedition, murder, and inciting war." "By who?" Jed Stone roared. "By you. This ain't no trial." Mott slammed the butt of his rifle into Jed's ribs. The blacksmith grunted and fell to his knees. The crowd murmured. This was not justice. This was a performance. "The sentence," Pike continued, ignoring the interruption, "is death by hanging, to be carried out immediately, as a clear and final warning." He nodded. Mott and his men shoved Claire and Naichi toward the gallows stairs. Jed was left on the ground, guarded. As Claire's foot touched the first step, she saw Lola Esquivel. The woman was standing near the town bell, her face a mask of tears and fury. She was not just watching, she was waiting, and in her hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt, was a long, curved skinning knife. They were forced up onto the platform. The world became very small, very high. Claire could see the entire town, the flat roofs, the dirty street, and beyond. The red, endless canyons. Two of Pike's men, their faces rough and indifferent, placed the nooses. The rope was new, stiff and abrasive against her neck. She looked at Naichi. He was not looking at the rope. He was looking at the sun. He had his eyes closed, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Pike looked at his watch. He seemed to be waiting for something. "Any final words?" Pike asked. A perfunctory, cruel gesture. Naichi opened his eyes. He looked, not at Pike, but at the crowd. "You are hanging a man," he said, his voice clear, "for a crime you committed." "Hang them!" Slate shrieked, his nerve breaking. "Hang them now!" Pike raised his hand. He was still looking at his watch. He was timing this. "In 3 minutes," he said, his voice low. To his men, Claire did not understand. Why 3 minutes? Then she heard it, faint, far off, but clear. The sound of a fuse, a long, hissing fuse. She looked north, toward the canyon. Pike was not just killing them. He was erasing the evidence. "The dynamite," she whispered, the words lost in her throat. "The burial ground." Pike was timing the execution to match the final destruction of the sacred valley. He would destroy the graves and kill the witnesses, all in the same moment. Naichi heard it, too. His eyes snapped open, and the blaze in them was not fever. It was a pure, cold fire. He knew. Pike raised his hand. "Now!" The lever man, one of Pike's, put his hand on the wooden handle that would drop the trap door. Clang. A sound, so loud, so sudden, it shattered the moment. The town bell. Lola Esquivel was at the bell rope, hacking at it with her knife. Jed Stone was there, having thrown off his guard in the confusion. He grabbed the cut rope and pulled, sending a wild, chaotic, clanging alarm across the square. It was the signal for Apache attack. The town dissolved. People screamed, running for cover. Pike's men, trained mercenaries, instinctively raised their rifles, not at the prisoners, but at the surrounding hills. It was chaos. It was the chance. Now, Naichi hissed. He was not a man. He was a force. He lunged, not forward, but sideways. He slammed his body into the lever man, sending him sprawling. The trapdoor did not drop. The man with the noose, the executioner, drew his pistol. Naichi did not wait. His hands were bound, but he grabbed the rope around his neck, the free end of it, and in a single, fluid motion, he looped it around the executioner's throat. He pulled. The man gagged, dropping his pistol. Naichi was already moving. He grabbed Claire, his bound hands fumbling, his good arm a band of iron. The rope! Cut it! He shoved her toward the executioner's fallen pistol and knife. She grabbed the knife. She sawed at the thick hemp noose around his neck. It fell away. "Now yours," he said. She cut her own. They were free, but they were on a platform, 10 feet high, surrounded. Mott was the first to recover. He raised his rifle. "They are loose. Shoot them." Boom! The world exploded. Not the gallows. The north. A massive, rolling concussion of sound that was not just heard, but felt. A pillar of dust and smoke rose from the canyon. A dirty mushroom cloud that blotted out the sun. Pike's dynamite. The shockwave hit the town. Windows shattered. Dust rained down. Naichi did not hesitate. He grabbed Claire around the waist. "Hold," he said, and he jumped. He jumped from the platform, using his body to shield hers, hitting the dusty ground in a roll that sent a spike of agony through his wounded shoulder. He did not cry out. "Go!" Jed Stone roared, holding a hammer he had grabbed from his own smithy. "This way." The town was in total pandemonium. Dust, smoke, and screaming. "They are heading for the alley," Mott shouted. Naichi pulled Claire to her feet. "Split," he said, his voice a raw command. "What?" "He wants me. I will lead them. You, stop the fire." She looked. She knew what he meant. The dynamite. There would be more. Near the edge of town, on the bluff overlooking the canyon, was a small, canvas-covered station. The detonator, the plunger box. "I will lead them to the keyhole," he said to Jed. "Block it when I'm in." "Go," Jed said. Naichi looked at Claire. He grabbed her face, his good hand hot and rough. "You stop it. You breathe. You squeeze." He was gone. He ran. A bleeding, limping, impossible target, straight for the narrowest alley in town, the one called the Keyhole. "After him," Mott yelled. "He is the prize." Mott and 3 of Pike's men charged after him, their boots pounding, into the trap. Pike was on the ground, his face black with rage. He saw Claire. "You stop her. She is heading for the detonator." He was right. Claire was running, not from, but toward the bluff, toward the blasting station. Pike and 2 of his men ran after her. It was a race. She scrambled up the rocky path, her lungs on fire. She could see the station. It was just a table, with a wooden plunger box and a telegraph wire spool, and a man, a nervous-looking man in a flannel shirt, was already wiring a second charge. Pike was close, scrambling up the path behind her. "Shoot her!" A bullet kicked up dust by her feet. She dove, rolling behind a stack of powder kegs. The man at the detonator looked up, his face pale. "Colonel, what is—" "Just arm at arm the second charge. We have to seal the canyon." The man, his hands shaking, connected the wires. "It is ready, sir." "Claire," Pike shouted. "It is over. Come out." She peeked. Pike was 30 yards away, using a rock for cover. His men were fanned out, and she saw it. The Spencer, the rifle she had left. It was leaning against the blasting table. Where the operator had left it, she had a choice. Do not shoot to kill, shoot to stop. She looked at the plunger box. A wooden box with 2 brass connectors and a T-handle. Pike raised his head. "Last chance, girl." She took a breath. She made the world small. She made it just the box. She burst from behind the kegs. She did not run for cover. She ran for the rifle. The blasting operator yelled. Pike fired. The bullet tore through the sleeve of her shirt. a hot, stinging line. She grabbed the Spencer. She did not aim at Pike. She aimed at the box. The operator lunged for the T-handle. Breathe in, breathe out, squeeze. She fired. The rifle bucked. The shot was perfect. The heavy .56 caliber bullet hit the wooden box. It did not explode. It shattered. Wood, brass, and copper wire flew into the air. The connection was broken. The operator stared, his hand frozen in the air. At the wreckage of his machine, Pike screamed, a sound of pure, inhuman rage. "Mott, Mott, where are you?" A single sharp crack from the town below. A new sound. Harlan Mott. He was on a roof, overlooking the bluff. He had seen her. He had seen his prize, Naichi, vanish into the alley, and he saw the woman who had shot his horse. He raised his rifle. He did not aim at the box. He aimed at her heart. He fired. Claire saw the puff of smoke from his barrel. She was frozen, the rifle still in her hands. A body slammed into her. Not a bullet. A body. Naichi. He hit her with the force of a train, knocking her to the ground, his body covering hers as the bullet screamed over their heads. "I told you," he hissed, his voice raw, his breath hot in her ear. "To breathe." He had led them into the alley, and Jed had blocked it, trapping them. Naichi had not stayed. He had climbed the buildings, a bleeding shadow, and he had come for her. "Get up," he said, pulling her. Pike was there. He had climbed the bluff, his pistol in his hand. "End of the line. Savage," Pike said, his face a mask of sweat and dust. Naichi shoved Claire behind him. He had his knife, a knife against a pistol. "You burned my home," Naichi said, his voice low. "I built a new world," Pike said, and he fired. He fired at Naichi's chest. But Naichi was not there. He had moved, a blur of motion, so fast it was impossible. The bullet took him in the arm, the good arm. He roared, but he was inside Pike's guard. The two men crashed to the ground. It was not a fight. It was a butchering. Pike was a soldier, a brawler. Naichi was a warrior. He was wounded, half dead, but he was pure, focused rage. He did not use the knife. He used his hands. He used the force. He hit Pike in the throat. He broke his wrist. He rolled on top, the knife in his hand. The blade pressed so hard against Pike's neck it drew a thin line of blood. "Do it," Pike choked, his eyes bulging. "Do it." Naichi looked down at the man who had ordered the lies, the fire, the desecration. He looked at the blood on his own knife. He saw Claire watching, her face pale, the Spencer in her hands. He saw his grandfather's face. He saw the white flag. He put the knife down. He did not kill him. He looked at Pike, and he spoke. "No, you will not die. You will live. You will live with this." He took the pigging string from his own belt, the one he had taken from Mott, and he tied Pike's hands. He stood, swaying, a bloody, terrible wreck of a man. He fumbled in Pike's coat. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book, a ledger. He opened it. "Slate, Barnaby," he read, his voice thick. "For information, $50. The square below was silent. The rain of dust had stopped. The townsfolk, drawn by the new round of gunfire, were at the bottom of the bluff. Looking up, Jed Stone was holding Harlan Mott, his arm in a hammerlock. Lola was standing next to him. The crowd had heard. "He paid Slate," a man whispered. It was a lie. The crowd looked at Slate, who was trying to slip into his shop. Jed pointed. "Get him." Two miners, men who had lost their credit to Slate, grabbed him. The town had turned. Naichi stood at the edge of the bluff, the ledger in his hand. He had won. And then the sky tore open. It was not a drizzle. It was a sudden, violent, cleansing flood. The first rain of the season. It came down in sheets. A cold, gray curtain that washed the dust from the air, that turned the square to mud, that hissed on the hot rifle barrels. It was a baptism. The distant fire, the one at the Sacred Valley, would be doused. The blood on the gallows, the dust on the bluff. It was all being washed clean. Naichi stood in the rain, his face to the sky, and he let it wash the blood from his shoulder. the fever from his eyes. Claire walked to him. She was shaking. Not from cold, from shock. Her body had finally realized what it had been through. She was going to fall. He caught her. He pulled her from the bluff, into the small, dark lee of the blasting station. Out of the rain, out of sight. She was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. He did not speak. He just held her. He pulled her against his chest, his good arm, his wounded arm, all of him. He held her, tight, absorbing the tremors. He was hot, burning with fever, and he was the only solid thing in her spinning world. She buried her face in his neck, in his wet hair, and she held on. He held her for a long time. As the rain hammered the canvas roof, he whispered something. Not in English. In Apache. A low, soft sound. "What?" she whispered, her voice muffled. He pulled back, just enough to look at her. His eyes were no longer hard. They were just tired. And clear. He repeated it, his voice a raw whisper, his breath warm on her face. "Ash, Kenny, it means, when you want." He was looking at her, his gaze a question, not a demand. He was offering, not taking. He had learned. She looked at his face, at the scar, at the tired eyes, at the man who had stopped, at the man who had chosen a different kind of force. She did not owe him. He did not owe her. She chose. She put her cold, shaking hand on his neck, and she pulled his face to hers. She nodded, a single, small movement. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not of fire. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief. It was slow. It was hesitant. It was a promise, made in the dark, with the sound of the world being washed clean all around them. It was a beginning, and as the rain fell, the darkness in the small, canvas shelter was absolute. The rain stopped before dawn. It left the world scoured, new, and smelling of wet dust and creosote. The gallows, half-built and glistening, looked like a monument to a madness that had already passed. In the cold, gray light, the town woke to a new reality. The power was broken. Jedstone, his face set like cold iron, unbarred the door to the smithy. He and the town marshal, a man named Pharaoh, who had rediscovered his spine now that Pike's rifles were silent, marched their prisoners into the square. Colonel Beauregard Pike was no longer a commander. He was a criminal, his uniform stained, his broken wrist bound with a piece of dirty rope. Harlan Mott was just a man with a shattered leg, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, pained silence. And Barnaby Slate was a weeping, blubbering wreck, his power gone, his reign of rumor and ink over. "They go to Tucson," Jed announced, his voice carrying in the clean, cold air. The small crowd of miners and teamsters just nodded. They were tired. "The federal marshal can have them. The army can have Pike. But we are done with them." Lola Esquivel stepped forward. She was not the same woman who had stood on the auction block. Her eyes were hard. She pointed at Slate. "And him his book, Our Debts." Jed Stone looked at the sobbing man. He did not speak. He walked across the square to the Dead Mule trading post. He kicked the door open. The hinges splintered. He was inside for only a moment. He returned, holding the thick, greasy, leather-bound ledger, the book that had held the town in chains. He held it up. "Who here owes this man?" A dozen hands went up, weary hands. "This," Jed said, "is a liar's book." He did not burn it. He walked to the horse trough, still overflowing from the rain, and he dropped the book into the water. They watched the ink bleed from the pages, turning the clean water black. Barnaby Slate let out a low, animal wail. His life, his power, was a sodden, dissolving pulp. Jed Stone turned his back on him. The Dead Mule was closed. They did not leave immediately. They could not. Naichi was on fire with a fever, the bullet wound in his shoulder, and the new one that had torn through his good arm, had been too much. He was strong, but he was not made of stone. Claire and Lola moved him from the smithy to the small, clean back room of Jed's house. For 3 days and 3 nights, he did not know where he was. He drifted in a red, painful haze, speaking in the low, guttural words of his own tongue. He spoke to his grandfather. He spoke to the fire. Claire did not leave his side. She sat in the quiet, dark room, a basin of cool water beside her. She bathed his face. She forced water, drop by drop, between his cracked lips. She cleaned the wounds, her hands steady, her heart a cold, tight knot of fear. She had seen him as a force of nature, a shadow on the rocks, a vengeful spirit. Now he was just a man, hot and broken, his life held by a thread. She held his unbandaged hand, a small, cool anchor in his sea of fever. On the fourth morning, she awoke with a start, her head stiff from sleeping in the chair. He was watching her. His eyes were clear. The fever was broken. He did not speak. He did not thank her. He just looked at her, a long, quiet look of assessment. He was Nietzsche again. He nodded. Once. She let out a breath she had been holding for 3 days. It took another week, a week of broth, which Jed brought, and bitter herbs, which Lola knew how to brew. A week of him sitting in the sun outside the smithy, his body regaining its silent strength, his wounds closing. When he could stand without swaying, he looked at her. We go. The journey back to the canyon was not a flight. It was a pilgrimage. He walked slowly, favoring his left side. She walked beside him, her own bruised leg a dull memory. They moved as a pair, in a shared, comfortable silence. The valley was quiet. The rain had done its work. The blasting site was a messy scar on the landscape. But the detonator was smashed, the second charge never blown. The entrance to the sacred valley was not sealed. They went first to the burial ground. The site was a fresh grief. The ceremonial lodge was gone. It was a circle of black, charred ribs, a skeleton, smelling of wet ash and sacrilege. The wind moved through the ruins, a low, mournful sound. Nietzsche stood, his face a mask of stone. He was looking at the destruction of his past. He knelt, from a pouch at his belt. He took a handful of yellow cornmeal. He began to chant, his voice low, not a song of anger, but one of peace, a song of asking. He sprinkled the cornmeal over the ashes, a bright yellow offering to the blackened ground. He was speaking to the spirits, telling them they were not forgotten, asking them to forgive the trespass. Claire stood back. This was his place, his grief. But she was the one who had led the sacrilege here, her clean, precise maps. Her guilt was a physical weight. She reached into her pocket. She still had it. The folded square of linen. Her mother's handkerchief. It was stiff, stained with his blood and the mud of the Rio Seco. It was the last thing she had of her old life. She stepped forward, her boots silent on the damp earth. She knelt beside him. He paused his song, watching her. She said nothing. She unfolded the cloth. She laid it gently on the edge of the ash circle, a white square against the black, an offering, an apology, a piece of her own past, her own ancestors. Given in tribute to his, he looked at the handkerchief. He looked at her. He understood. He finished his song, his voice a little stronger. They knelt together, two people from two worlds, apologizing to the same earth. Later, she went to her old camp, the one she had made when she was still a surveyor. It was untouched, as she had left it. Her tent, her watercolors, her journals, and her locked metal box. She brought the box back to the stream, near where they had camped. Nietzsche sat, watching, as she built a small, clean fire. She opened the box with her key. Inside was her payment from Pike, a stack of greenbacks, and her papers, her official commission from the Geographical Society, her contract with Colonel Pike, her detailed, handwritten instructions. Mark the water grades. Note all narrow passes. Find the choke point for the reservoir. She took the contract first. She fed it to the flames. She watched Pike's neat signature, the one that had owned her, turn black, curl, and vanish. She burned the instructions, the paper that had betrayed the valley. She burned the money, bill by bill, watching the pale green turn to gray ash. The wind, the old wind of the canyon, caught the flakes. It lifted them, a small, dark cloud, and carried them south, back toward the world of contracts and ledgers. She was free. She had no money, no job, and no paper to prove who she was. She had never been so free. When the last ash had flown, Nietzsche stood. He reached into his own tunic. He held out his hand. In his palm was her brass compass. "You left this," he said. She took it. The metal was warm from his body. "It led me here," she said. "It led you to the wrong place." "No," she said, looking at him. "It led me to the right one. It just took the long way." He almost smiled. She walked to the small shelter he had built against a rock, a simple lean-to of willow. He had hung his mother's beaded amulet from a peg to bless the small home. Claire took a strip of leather. She tied it to her compass. She hung it on the peg, next to the amulet, the tool of science and the vessel of spirit, the way in and the way home. They hung side by side, two parts of the same map. They returned to the town a few days later. It was changing. Jedstone's smithy was the new heart of the Dead Mule. The saloon was quieter. The gaming tables were gone. Jed, his arm thick with muscle, was hammering a red-hot wagon wheel. He had a new sign, painted on fresh wood. "Jedstone, Smith and Wagon Repair, all welcome." He meant it. Claire saw him, his broad back bent, showing a young Apache boy, one of Nietzsche's band who had come down from the hills, how to work the great bellows. The boy's face was intent, serious. Lola Esquivel, no longer a widow in debt, was running a small kitchen from the side of the smithy. She sold hot coffee and fresh tortillas to the teamsters. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting chilies, not stale whiskey. The hate was not gone. Claire still saw it in the eyes of some of the older miners, the ones who had lost friends to Apache raids years ago. But the fear, the immediate, blind terror, had been broken by Pike's lie. The town was breathing again. Nietzsche had to rebuild. The sacred lodge was gone. He chose a new place, not on the high, exposed mesa, but in a quiet grove of cottonwoods, beside the stream that ran through the valley. He and Claire began to build. On the second day, Jedstone rode out, his mule loaded with tools and rope. Lola came with a basket of food. They built a new lodge. It was a simple, strong circle of willow branches and fresh skins. It was open. It was clean. When it was done, Jed took a piece of scrap wood and his knife. He carved a symbol, a simple, open hand. He nailed it to the entryway. "No locks," Nietzsche said, touching the carving. "This is not a fort. This is a house of spirit. You come here. You leave your rifle outside. You leave your iron." He looked at Jed, a rare, warm light in his eyes. "You are welcome." Jed nodded. "I will come." That night, the sky was a black, velvet cloth, punched with 1,000,000 diamond-bright stars. The air was cold, sharp, and clean. Nietzsche and Claire stood outside the new lodge. The sound of the stream was a low, constant murmur. He did not have his flute. He did not need it. He stood in front of her. He did not ask. He did not promise. He did not offer. He just held out his hand. The one she had bandaged. The wound was a new, clean scar. White linen no longer needed. She put her hand in his. "We are not of the paper," he said, his voice quiet. "We are not of the debt." She answered, her voice just as low. He looked up at the stars, at the spirits of his grandfathers. "Da Gotse," he said. "It means a shared path." She met his gaze. "A shared word." He closed his strong fingers around hers. "A shared choice." It was not a wedding. It was not a contract. It was a promise. It was enough. The old wind of the canyon moved through the cottonwood leaves, but it was not a lonely sound. It was just the world, breathing. The silence between them was no longer the silence of fear, or of waiting, or of anger. It was warm. It was full. It was home. They did not build in the valley. They built on the high rock ledge. The one where he had first taught her to shoot. The one that overlooked the sacred burial ground and the wide, sun-drenched pass. It was a house built of two worlds, solid as the rock it stood on. Jed Stone brought the pine logs up, his mules straining, a gift from the town. Naichi, his arm still healing but his strength returning, set the foundations, not with iron nails, but with notched, fitted joinery that was stronger than any spike. It was a small house. Just one room, but it was solid. It was built to withstand the wind. Claire designed the window. It was a single, large pane of glass, a miracle brought by wagon from Santa Fe, a gift from Lola. It faced south and it filled the small room with a clean, golden light. Inside, they built one piece of furniture that defined them, a long, heavy table, sanded smooth as glass. On one end, Claire kept her new maps. They were not maps for railroads or dams. They were maps of the springs, the safe passes, the places where wild herbs grew. On the other end, Naichi worked, fletching his arrows, the bright feathers of the hawk and the turkey set beside his sinew and his knife. Maps and arrows, side by side, on the same table. They had to make a living. The world below had changed, but it was still a hard world. Naichi, using his knowledge of the rock, helped Jed build a series of stone funnels high in the pass, a clever, ancient design that captured the rare rainfall and the morning dew, funneling it into a clean, deep cistern. It became the new water station, the one that replaced the dead mule's brackish well. Travelers paid Jed for the water, and Jed split the coin, fair and square. Claire, in the afternoons, found she had a new profession. The children came. First, the shy, dark-eyed Apache children from Naichi's band, who had come down to the new, safe valley. Then, two of the miners' children from the post, sent by their mothers, who had seen that the Apache woman was quiet and clean and knew things. She opened a school in the sun outside her small house. She did not have books. She did not have slates. She had charcoal and smooth, flat stones. She taught them their letters. She taught them their numbers. She taught the Apache children English, and she learned from them the Apache words for sun and water and home. It was a new language, being born on a rock ledge. Naichi found his own place. He was no longer a hunted hostel. He was a guardian. He organized the young men of his band, and a few of the younger, more open-minded men from the post, into a patrol. They did not hunt men. They hunted trouble. They guided travelers, a year after the hanging that never was. A wagon train, lost and starving, was found wandering into the dry lands. They were found by Naichi and Jed Stone, riding together. The settlers, terrified, raised their rifles at the sight of the Apache chief. Then they saw Claire, riding beside him, her hair tied back, a rifle of her own across her saddle. "It is all right," she had called out, her voice clear and calm. "You are safe. We will take you to water." They became a new kind of legend, not the savage and his captive, but the guide and his map maker. The story spread, passed from wagon train to wagon train, a new, true rumor that replaced Pike's old lies. Down at the trading post, the name was finally changed. Jed Stone, now the unofficial mayor of the small, growing community, took down the old, sun-bleached sign that read, "Dead Mule Trading Post." He put up a new one. It was simple, carved deep into fresh pine. It did not have a name. It had a code. 3 lines, for all to see. No selling people, no fakes, no burning sacred land. It was the new law of the canyon. The railroad came. It was inevitable. A force of iron and money that could not be stopped, only diverted. But Pike was gone, disgraced, his contract broken. The new surveyors, a different company, had looked at Claire's old, false maps, the ones that marked the sacred valley as a box canyon. They had seen the site of the failed blasting. They had seen the new, quiet but watchful town. They had decided it was too much trouble. From the window of their house, Claire and Naichi watched. One afternoon, as the first train went by, it was 5 miles to the south, a thin black ribbon of smoke against the sky. It followed the line of the barren, southern hills. It had gone around. The valley was safe. That evening, the air was cool, the first hint of the second autumn they had shared. They sat outside their home, watching the sun set, a spectacular, silent explosion of orange and purple. Naichi was quiet, his hands resting on his knees, the scars on his arms. The bullet wounds from Pike and Mott had healed, pale marks against his dark skin. Claire reached out. She did not touch the bullet wounds. She touched his wrist, the one that had been bound, the one that still bore the faint, pale line from the noose. The gallows had been torn down. Its wood used to build a new bridge over the Rio Seco, but the scar remained. He did not flinch, but she felt him grow still. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice soft. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at her hand on his skin. He closed his eyes. "It hurts less," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Every time you look at me like that, it hurts less." She held his hand, her fingers tracing the faint line. He had once told her that force was the only thing he knew. It was not true. He knew this. He knew the quiet, steady strength of a house on a rock, of a school in the sun, of a hand held in the twilight. This was the new force, the force that healed, the force that built, the force that chose, every day, to protect, not to possess. The next morning, they walked down to the small, rich patch of earth by the stream, the place where the lodge had burned. The ash was long gone, washed away, and the earth was new. He carried a bag of seed corn, a deep, beautiful, blue-black color. He pressed a handful of seeds into her palm. They knelt, side by side, and they began to plant. They pushed the seeds into the damp, cool earth, a promise for the next season. A gentle, misty rain began to fall, the first of the new year, as if the sky itself was blessing the act, far, far in the distance. So far it was barely a sound. A wolf howled, but it was not the lonely, hungry sound of that first night. It was just a wolf, in its own place, a long way off. Naichi stood, wiping the good, dark earth from his hands. He looked at the valley, at the planted field, at the house on the rock. He did not need to speak. He raised his reed flute to his lips. A melody drifted out over the valley. It was the sound of the wind, the sound of water, the sound of a hawk. But it was not a lonely sound. It was the sound of a man, on his own land, in his own home. Below them, the iron of the railroad passed by, far in the distance. A different world, a world that could not touch them. The canyon was free, the land endured. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give this video a like and hit that hype button. It truly helps get these stories out to more listeners, and your support means the world.